stopping the recording and starting it again so that we have two clear videos, one for the review of 5.1 and one for 5.2. I like the other way better. All right, so 5.2 is all about food production. Okay, so terrestrial means what? Terra, Spanish, terrestrial, not extraterrestrial, not in another land. So terrestrial is where? In the water, in the atmosphere, on land. Excellent. So we're talking about making food on the land, as opposed to, and this is important to differentiate, as opposed to in the water, right? Because we can. That's fish farming, right? That's aquaculture. But we're talking about terrestrial food production systems and then the choices that we make. All right, and 5.2 is chock full of information. There's a ton here. So, you know, we're not going to be able to get through every single piece of this to the level of detail that we might like to. Mr. Tout did a fantastic job trying to condense this as much as possible and putting this together. It's not easy, okay?
And I want to reiterate, those of you guys who are trying to boost your reading notes grade, remember my recommendation for doing reading notes is, you know, set a timer for yourself. Plan on spending half an hour, right? And a little bit more is fine, a little bit less is fine, but about half an hour on your reading notes. This section is like 20 pages long. So just know that, like, in terms of preparing your reading notes, you're going to have to skim. You're going to have to pick and choose sections, pick and choose, you know, the topics, right? It doesn't mean you should spend 4 hours doing your reading notes. That's what the lecturer does. So, you know, in terms of getting your reading notes grade up, you know, set that timer, you know, practice using the textbook as a resource, but that doesn't mean read every word, because that's not unless that's your best way of learning, which is about 10% of you. For the majority of you, using it as a resource means skimming it, pulling out key terms, right? Trying to figure out what a diagram is actually about rather than reading each word.
So part one of this, which hopefully we'll get through part one today, are the types of agricultural systems. So there are three major types of agricultural systems. There's subsistence farming, there's commercial farming, and there's pastoral farming. Now, what does it mean to do subsistence farming? Yep. That's only for yourself. Typically, we see subsistence farming happening in LEDCs. When I was in Africa, the city I was in, almost every single family in that city, they had a farm of their own. They had a little garden. I mean, calling it a garden doesn't really do it justice. It's how they got most of their food. All right. And because I was in a city, there were farms that they went to that were just outside of the city limits, where everyone had their own little plot of land, and they would, families would buy smaller plots from each other. And if they had more kids, they would do all sorts of different things. But that was subsistence farming. The mom of the family would typically go out with the daughters every morning, or maybe the smaller sons, and they would do their farming, and they would pull weeds and pull produce, and that would determine what they were eating for the day. And so typically it's what's called polyculture. It's more than one plant. So for those of you asking to post the lecture on YouTube, yes, we will. Pay attention to it now, okay? Polyculture is where there are more than one plant that you're planting. Poly mean many, culture meaning basically growing, all right? So you're growing a lot of different things. And so, or culture really meaning life, sorry. So you're growing a lot of different living things, and that means that you've got your tomatoes alongside your potatoes, alongside of your kale, alongside of your lettuce, alongside of everything else, carrots. You have a little bit of everything, and that makes sure that you've got enough general food in order to make it through. And so this sort of farming, there's less inputs and outputs. Okay, it's lower density. You're doing what you can on the plot of land you can do it in, but you're not packing it in, trying to pack as much corn as you can per square meter in order to sell some at the market, or in order to sell some to your neighbor. You're just trying to make things work for your own family. And so it's not as efficient as it could be. Okay. Then there's commercial farming. And this is a picture of commercial farming. By the way, this is kind of what subsistence farming looks like. But here's some commercial farming. Typically, this is monoculture. What do we mean by monoculture? One, yeah, that's just the one crop. I'm not quite sure what we're looking at here, but this could be something like soybeans. Throughout the Midwest, there are cornfields upon cornfields upon cornfields. There's soybean farms. There's alfalfa that's being grown all the time. There's, of course, all sorts of grasses being produced for hay. There's wheat. Typically, those are grown monoculture. These farms just grow one thing for acres and acres and acres and acres. That's all they're growing. And obviously, they're not eating it all themselves. That's absurd. They're selling it, right? And so they're selling it for a profit. A lot of these farms, they don't eat any of it themselves, because it's not produced for even human consumption in a lot of cases. It's produced for fuel, or it's produced to feed livestock. And then you have pastoral agriculture. And pastoral agriculture is where we're talking about raising livestock. So that could be cows, that could be pigs, that could be goats, that could be chickens, all sorts of different livestock, all right? And that's exclusively livestock, is pastoral. So here, I want you to help us out and choose for each of soil use, fossil fuel use, water use, and fertilizers and pesticides, which is more sustainable. Commercial, which is typically commercial farming, which is typically done in MEDCs, or subsistence farming, which is typically done in LEDCs. So you can feel free to in Zoom, annotate and make a check or an X where you think, if you think it's commercial for soil use or you think it's subsistence for soil use, make a check or an X in whichever side you think it is. Or you can respond in the comments. Or you can unmute yourself. Any way you would like to participate. Okay, so Dade says soil use LEDC. Keep it coming. All right, George. Wait, no, I did that wrong.
Oh, oh yeah, right, left, left. Yeah, there you go. Got it.
Okay, more votes. Hey, Mr. Tout, are there right answers for this?
When I was making this slide, I had right answers in mind, but there are certainly exceptions. How's that?
Mm-hmm.
So one can do subsistence farming in a very unsustainable way, and one can do commercial farming in a sustainable way. But those are not the stereotypes.
All right, so most people have chimed in so far. Mr. Tout, do you want to go over what you would say as the right answers?
So certainly commercial farming is considered intensive on the soil. So as an intensive, it's very high input, high output. They're taking a lot out of the soil. It's very hard on the soil. So subsistence farming is generally more sustainable. Commercial use of soil means, if you guys don't mind me jumping around a little bit, it requires, in order to keep the soil arable, in order to keep it fertile, you need to use a lot of fertilizers. So there we're jumping down to, at the bottom, right, you need a lot more use of fertilizers and pesticides with commercial farming. That being said, on the commercial level, more can be done to prevent those pesticides or fertilizers from, well, they're better monitored on the commercial level, whereas on the subsistence level, they're just, if people use pesticides, they're not monitored at all. So there's a lot more pesticides, a lot more fertilizers used with commercial farming. So that one, I feel like you could make an argument for either way. Now, water use, certainly commercial farming uses a lot more water and a lot more fossil fuels. So in terms of in terms of the sustainability of it, subsistence farming is a lot more sustainable with both fossil fuel use and water use.
And so if we were going to put human labor on here, which would be more sustainable? Like the amount of effort that it requires on the part of a human or humans to sustain a commercial farm versus a subsistence farm, which seems more sustainable? So in your LEDC, imagine getting up every morning, walking out to your farm, spending 3-4 hours out there, pulling weeds, planting things, getting your produce, cleaning up. In MEDCs, you get in your tractor. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot more human labor required. It's a lot less sustainable from a individual human perspective. All right, you don't have time to do much else if you're a subsistence farmer. If you're a commercial farmer, a lot of commercial farmers spend most of their time doing non-farming tasks. All right, and so Mr. Tout also poses a second question here for you about which produces more food for our growing population. And this is really where we're going to get to in this, in 5.2. So respond in the chat to Mr. Tout as you do the matching.
Yay, matching, my favorite.
Some of these definitions have some overlap, so it can be a little tricky.
Well, this is very tricky, I think. Very nuanced.
Yes. Good job to the 4 of you finished. I see someone's plugging along. Again, there's a lot of nuance here. All right, we'll take another 20 seconds with this and go ahead, make sure to respond in the chat to Mr. Tout's second question there.
I got a couple answers privately, so.
Oh, excellent. All right. Good job. So real quick, I think the one that we didn't talk about, intensive versus extensive agriculture. Extensive agriculture is less dense polyculture. Extensive meaning it extends. So you can think of it as big, all right, where you don't pack things in and you have a lot of different crops. And then there's intensive agriculture. That is like your corn, your wheat farming, where it's just one crop. And it's typically bad for the soil. All right, we got through part 1, so we can start on part 2 real quick. So we've got food facts. All right, there are some terms we need to be familiar with. Malnutrition is not just, it's not like not just being skinny or something like that, right? It's being undernourished, having an unbalanced diet, or it's being overnourished. All right, malnutrition is literally bad nutrition, and so that it can be in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, and just to clarify, undernourishment is the one everyone thinks of, right? People who don't have access to enough food, who are starving. That's the one that people always think of when they hear malnutrition. You may be aware that in the US and in several other countries, we're actually struggling also with overnourishment, or what some people call the obesity epidemic. We are, it's one of the issues that we struggle with as a nation because of our access to a lot of food and not necessarily healthy food. We end up with choices that are hard to, it's oftentimes hard to choose the healthy thing when there is pizza staring you in the face, right? Or something like that. And then the unbalanced diet is this sort of middle ground, but the focus there is a lack of access to micronutrients. So someone who has an unbalanced diet probably has enough calories. They have access to carbohydrates like rice, but they probably aren't getting any vegetables, or they aren't getting enough of the vitamins and other micronutrients that your body needs in order to do the sort of day-to-day healthy growth and processing that we do.
And so in MEDCs, typically we see a lot of that overnourishment, where in MEDCs, like the United States, food is relatively cheap and accessible year-round. You can get strawberries any time of year, despite the fact that strawberry growing season is all of like a month or two long. Industrial agriculture has political influence, marketing departments, and so they're able to lobby for more money for subsidies from the government to help make food cheap for people, and certain foods cheap. Whereas LEDCs, typically populations struggle to feed themselves. They have a lot of problems with undernourishment and unbalanced diets, like those micronutrients that Mr. Tout was just talking about. There are all sorts of limitations on food production that come from politics, that come from economics, where you can't afford to grow much more. You can't afford the land, you can't afford the fertilizers. There's environmental limitations where you're trying to like grow stuff on a hill and your soil keeps eroding. There's cash cropping, and that often uses that arable land, the actual farmable land is what that means. And it sends those products to the MEDCs. And so, Mr. Tout, do you want to conclude talking really briefly about this Tanzanian coffee farm?
Yeah, so there is one of the problems, one of the reasons why LEDCs struggle, right, is oftentimes a lack of good arable land, at least relative to the population. And so it's oftentimes it is oftentimes difficult in LEDCs for people to get enough food. That's why there's a lot of subsistence farming and people just feeding themselves. But to compound that issue, a lot of times that land is used for crops that are just going to be exported. So it's good in the fact that they're using some commercial farming, they're making money, but a lot of times that money goes into the hands of a extreme minority of wealthy people, rather than being used to grow more crops for that immediate population that is struggling with undernourishment. This is an example in Tanzania. This is in East Africa. I actually lived there for 6 months. This is a picture of a coffee farm. So you can see the farmer in the in the with his crops. The hut that you can see at the back of the photo is where he lives. That's his home. And so this is space that he is living on and farming, mostly to make money for someone else. So he's not actually making the money off of these coffee plants. He's just being paid a small stipend to basically live on the land and farm it. So I think I get a little bit emotional about this, but it's both, like use of the land and commercial farming is not bad, but it's hard when you're using the limited arable land for commercial farming and exporting in a LEDC.
Thank you. All right. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you tomorrow for more talk about food.